Culture eats strategy for breakfast. So, you can have a great security strategy, but if you don't have a culture of security, you're going to have a real problem.
Hi, this is your host Sapnil Bhartiya and welcome back to CISO Insights. And today we have with us once again Steve Winterfeld, Advisory CISO at Akamai. Steve, it's great to have you back on the show.
Always good to be back. Look forward to today's discussion.
Yeah, and today we are going to talk about situational awareness. What exactly does it mean?
Yeah. And so I love the quote, you can't protect what you don't know about. So part of situational awareness is making sure that you have, you know, complete situational awareness of all your environments. If you're an older company, you probably have a legacy environment, a data center and then cloud. If you're newer, you may be in one cloud or you may be in multiple clouds. But even if you're in one cloud, you probably still have some software as a service, SaaS functions. You have third party functions. And so when we talk about this, it is, do you understand your entire environment? And when we talk about that environment, do you understand where those things that matter are? Where's those things that, if they're impacted, might have a critical or, as we talked about recently, material impact?
And when it comes to situational awareness, whose responsibility is it? Where does the buck stop?
So I think, that goes to kind of your perspective. Ultimately, the CISO within cybersecurity is responsible for having that situational awareness. But then as you get into the different programs, it kind of starts to scale down. So I would say probably the place that I want my situational awareness to be consolidated is our security operations center. That's probably to me where I would do my correlation, do my remediation, and if I were in a breach situation where I would have my war room is built around that security operations center as a critical function.
Now let's talk about the difference between situational awareness and visibility.
We talk about visibility a lot, and I worry about some visibility because as we start to get more and more tools, sometimes I'm just in, I feel like I'm dealing with the data ocean and I'm almost in analysis paralysis. I have too much information. And so I spend more time figuring out what information is important. And that's where I want to say, I don't want complete visibility. I want situational awareness. So if I'm walking down the street in my neighborhood here in Denver, Colorado, my situational awareness of what is a dangerous thing is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of dangers. But if I go, downtown, this is an area that I don't know as well. It's a lot more dangers. And so now I'm challenged as a person just in a new environment, knowing what is something that's dangerous and I should pay attention to, and what's something that seems like it might be unusual but isn't actually dangerous, and things that I'm focusing on that aren't dangerous at all. And so as we take that same, understanding of what the real threats are into cyber, it is looking at that environment and saying, okay, first of all, what do I need to protect? And what risk is it at? And what data do I have to understand that risk? I think that's where I want to move away from the concept of, do I have visibility, to do I have situational awareness and can respond to those threats? I mean, the classic example is, humans are designed to synthesize things quickly because we have a lot of data and focus on risk that are going to harm us. We need to do that same thing in cybersecurity.
And when we talk about situational awareness, what are the critical perspectives there?
So I think part of what they're looking at is their perspective. At the tactical level, again, we'll go back to the discussion around the SOC. They're very tactical. And so they want to know what are the dangers on individual systems. They're very finite. And so as they're looking, what is a behavior? Is a database talking to the internet? Is somebody interacting with uh, my employee access control in an abusive way? Are customer facing capabilities, are those being assaulted? So very much a tactical. Then if you move up to the operational level, for me, that's kind of where I am as a CISO at the programmatic level. I want to know what are the risks to my business partners? What are the risks to the revenue stream? What are our customer experience risk? How am I supporting fraud? How am I supporting ensuring that our employees aren't compromised? And so that's more of a programmatic view. Another view is when I work with the risk committee or my audit team, and it is that compliance risk. Am I at risk of being fined? Am I at risk of, some brand damage by being declared, not compliant, and I can no longer process credit cards or something? And then finally, the one that's probably the hardest is, that strategic risk. When I'm talking to the CEO or the board, that's a very different discussion than system risk. Now it is, what is a material risk? What are critical risks that could impact our ability to operate? We could go out of business. We could not meet our financial goals. And so as we talk about that situational awareness, the information I need to talk to the board is very different than the information I need to talk to the auditor about compliance, and very different than the SOC needs to ensure systems are safe. And so as I talk about situational awareness, the data I need, the threats I care about are different at each one of those levels. Does that make sense?
And how do you get this data? And also, how do you ensure that's relevant data for situational awareness?
And we said earlier, talking about that data lake, or in some cases, data ocean, it is understanding, if I have, let's say, 75 security tools, all of those are producing data. Some of those are producing data that is designed for me to prove that I'm compliant. Although most of us don't design our system to be compliant, but that I'm using that data to answer compliance questions. Others are designed for me to respond to specific threats at the tactical level. What data I need for talking to the board depends on kind of what the board is concerned about. And again, here we kind of talk about some of those big things. So as a CISO, I only can care about threats at scale. And a lot of the places I find threats are where we're using new technology or in transformation. And so the classic example here is, of course, around APIs. And we're publishing these APIs for people to interact with. But then some nefarious people, criminals or others, may come along and do API abuse. Not necessarily criminal, but use it in a way it wasn't intended, trying to harvest our information or launch attacks against us. And so that is, I need situational awareness around these new transformational things because it's something that could scale. So that's a way to think about it. Another is what are the threats to the business that could put us out of business? And I've said this before, but 7 years ago, 10 years ago, there were maybe a handful of companies that actually went out of business because of a cyber event. Today, there's over 100. And business email compromise and ransomware are probably the two that are driving most of that. And so business email compromise is probably around processes, business processes. And ransomware is probably, especially if you go look at NIST 800-207, around access control and segmentation. And so if we focus on segmentation, how do I reduce the scale of potential impact? And then, I get questions from the board like, Listen, I don't want to pay for cutting edge security, but I also don't want to be an industry laggard. So, how do I compare with our peers, those that are closest to our business model and scale and function? How do I compare to the industry? How do I compare to global trends? And I always joke because they want to be at the front of the middle of the pack. And so, that's another kind of question that I need external data about to answer the situational awareness of a board question. And so, again, the data I need is there. I always think of that data journey, the data coming in, moving lateral, going out. That's where I have my controls. And that's where I want to map the kind of data I can collect so I can answer all of those questions.
And when it comes to data, are tools enough to give the insight that is needed, or it's also about methodologies and strategies?
So I think ultimately, I think a lot of very specific criminal methodology attacks I would look at tools for. But for some others, what is employee experience? How are, have I reduced friction to the point where the employees aren't working around my security controls? Do I understand what the business is doing? And am I able to correlate my protections to the criticality of the business functions? So I agree that tools are one of the things I have to measure, but by far are more useful at the tactical end. As we get up higher into compliance and operational and ultimately strategic at the board and senior leader level, I think the tools become less directly measurable.
Fortunately, we live in a world where we are seeing emergence of a lot of new technologies. How does a CISO maintain a balance between the next shiny technology that teams can leverage, at the same time also ensuring that they may introduce new set of challenges and vulnerabilities?
You know, Complexity is the enemy of security. And so, exactly, when you talk about that next shiny object, um, I tend to worry about adding another tool where possible. And a lot of my peers are talking about this now. It is, first of all, is it something that one of my current vendors can provide? So I don't end up, adding another vendor management task. Don't add another, software set. Is it something I can do with my current tools if I optimize them or change where they're placed or I really do want to avoid getting a star player and getting what I would rather have is getting a great teammate or enhancing one of my current teammates.
What is your advice to CISOs so that their teams can continue to dip their toes in the latest, greatest, and shiny technologies, the latest buzzwords, so that they are not left behind without compromising on their security posture?
I mean, part of that is, that buzzword that you start to hear about. Obviously, right now, um, we've been using machine learning AI for a while, mostly supervised machine learning. I think now with the large language models or generative AI, uh, I see something emerging on the threat side. I see something emerging on the, capability side for both the business, which I have to protect, and within, the SOC, which could potentially use this to be more agile and cut down the manual work. So I think part of it is as I see the big trends coming along, those are important to look at and stay involved in. It's hard to know where that tipping point is where I actually want to commit to putting resources in, buying a capability or buying a protection. There are other things like quantum that I'm kind of waiting. I'm tracking what the discussions are. uh, and then finally, a lot of it is looking at where criminals are having success and understanding, is that threat model something I need to be concerned with?
What is the direct or indirect relationship between situational awareness and, let's say, cyber incidents?
There are two things. One, I always kind of break these into two categories. The first is, the flash to bang of zero. Flash to bang, again, if you haven't heard me talk about this, is if you see a lightning flash, you count 5 seconds, that's 1 mile. So lightning flash, count to 15, that lightning strike was 3 miles away. Um, but that flash to bang can be quick, it can be zero. And so a flash to bang of zero, something like ransomware takes you offline, denial of service attack takes you offline. Your situational awareness becomes really built around your crisis response plan being enacted immediately. Then there's the more classic example of someone broke into your network, they're stealing data, let's say credit card data over time. Eventually, let's say 3 months later, you discover that there's a data leak or exfil. You investigate it for a couple weeks. You solidify, you determine, in fact, you do have a breach. You declare it. You're in crisis management mode. And then, you're if you're a regulated industry, you're going and telling the regulators, you're making a public announcement. There's That is the more classic view of where situational awareness matters. Obviously, the difference between data leakage being discovered in 6 hours versus 3 months is huge. The ability to go in and say, okay, it's been happening for 3 months. Can I tell you what has happened in the past 3 months? Do I have logs to go back 3 months ago and find the initial entry point? And so these are the kind of situational awareness I want to know, which is when I talk to the leadership, I'm saying, hey, listen, your risk appetite is we're only storing data to do an investigation for 1 month, 6 months, 9 months, 7 years. So they understand the practicality of the limit of my situational awareness and to understand where I've accepted some risk on my situational awareness. I may be shorter amount of investigative logs. It may be lower visibility, which because originally I said there's not as much risk in these systems, so I'm going to accept there's not as much valuable data, so I'm going to accept more risk in these systems. But that means my situational awareness of those is lower. And if those were the initial entry, again, then I have a weaker chance of doing a successful investigation.
We talk a lot about culture these days. What is the role of culture when it comes to cybersecurity?
And I say this a lot, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So, you can have a great security strategy, but if you don't have a culture of security, you're going to have a real problem. And so, again, having people understand when they're in a dangerous neighborhood, when there's a dangerous email, when they're taking risk for the company. It doesn't mean I don't want them to take risk. It means I want my employees to take smart risk. We'll take artificial intelligence, the new large language models. I need to write a policy as a CISO on how people should use that. We mentioned developers. Worst case is a developer takes proprietary code, puts it in a large language model, and has them review that or try to improve it. Well, now that's been publicly consumed by that large language model, and it could be used and generated to other people's solutions. That's not a risk I want them to take. And so I need them to understand the situational awareness of what that risk would have been.
Earlier, you're talking about organization-wide policies. When it comes to situational awareness, is it enough to write an organization-wide policy and consider is good for the next 5 years, or it continues to evolve because the landscape is evolving?
Everything is a journey in cybersecurity. You know, anybody that says they've achieved zero trust is probably doesn't have a good understanding of what zero trust is, because the business model changes. And when the business model changes, the risk changes, and what I need to implement zero trust may change. The threat may change. And so again, I need to adapt and make sure that I can respond to the new threat methodology. Um, my maturity of my tools may wane over time, and I may need to understand, okay, this tool was great, 2 years ago, it's not great now. Um, my policies need to reflect the changing environment. Like I said, I probably didn't need a policy on artificial intelligence 3 years ago. And now, if you don't have one, it's probably a fail. And so all of this is a journey. I think the trick is understanding where to use your time.
How does situational awareness work when dealing with third parties?
So it's interesting. I've been involved with some incidents involving third parties, and worst case, um, as soon as there's an issue within the third party, um, their legal team is going to say, listen, we need to protect the company. You can't be telling people what's going on. We need to control the messaging. And so you went from talking to their technical team to their lawyers talking to your lawyers, and it's very much now a legal discussion. And then it comes down to what's in your contract. So I think the first and most important thing is to work with your vendor management team or work with your contracts folks and make sure that you have a contract that's going to make you successful in a third party incident or a supply chain incident. And so, what are your audit rights? What are your notification rights? Do they have to notify you when they're starting an investigation? Uh, when they find out they have a breach, before they notify it publicly, at the same time they notify publicly, at the same time they notify regulators. So again, if you want to avoid being surprised, then you need to write in some kind of notification SLA. And then validation. Are you allowed to do pen testing? Are you allowed to see the results of their pen test? Or how are you validating the security of what's going on? So ultimately, you want a good relationship with your third parties. You want a trusted relationship. But if things go bad with the cyber incident, you need to have that contractual protection and to have think through that, and ideally even do validation with some kind of an exercise on how they would communicate with you.
Well, one of the biggest buzzwords or hype these days is Gen AI. How does Gen AI fit into all of this?
I mean, ultimately, we're in first generation of large language model AIs. The first generation of SIMs, security event managers, were very immature. I felt like it was just watching critical events scroll off the screen. Now a few generations later, the SIM tools are automated. They're useful. They're so much better. I think we're going to go through that same thing with large language models. There's challenges now around, uh, I think it's called hallucinations, where they just come up with fake data. Again, a large language model is designed to generate a word, not generate the right answer, most likely word. And so where I see it would be useful is, if you're doing research and you have a private large language model and it's only looking at your company data, sometimes, we feel like it's digital archaeology trying to find the information within our own corporate policies or databases. Um, a generative AI would be great if you could go into the tool and just say, you know, what is our policy on privacy in this country? Um, it inside a tool, if you just say, have you seen any API abuse against this capability rather than trying to figure out how to go in and look in the logs and doing all that. I think that's where I'm hopeful that, it's going to make it much easier to just type in a human request and have it generate the clicks and the code and the right resource to let us work more efficiently.
Steve, thank you so much for joining me today and share great insights for our CISO Insights show. Thank you so much for those insights, and I look forward to our next episode. Thank you.
Thanks. Talk to you soon.